Good morning. How are you, Stacy?
I'm great. It's great to be here.
Thank you. So I'm going to start us off with just thanking our sponsor today. Nancy Hammond Editions have been a longtime supporter of the Aaron Levitas Foundation. They have incredible art in Annapolis, especially these times, whether it's to brighten your room or your office space, but they have things, I have stuff in my kids' rooms, in our bathroom. So check them out, but we're really thankful for their support today of part of our webinar series. So thank you to Nancy Hammond Editions. And today we're really excited to have Stacy Smith here, Director of Special Projects at the Center for Dispute Resolution at the University of Maryland, Francis King Carey School of Law. She has over 15 years experience in offering and promoting effective conflict resolution processes, including mediation, group facilitation, facilitated dialogues, negotiation, and restorative approaches. A handful there. It's amazing. And she mediates regularly for the District Court of Maryland and for the Baltimore City Office of Civil Rights in Employment and Discrimination Matters. And for the Anne Arundel County Conflict Resolution Center in Community, Parenting Plan, and Prisoner Reentry Matters. So this is just such incredible work, and we're so thankful to have you here. We also know that you help oversee the Levitas Initiative at the University of Maryland Law School, and we're excited to dive in today. So thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here. It's
Great.
great.
So awesome. So my first thing is, I'm curious what you are seeing being done in schools around discipline, as today we're going to kind of talk about what's happening in the schools with kids around that topic.
Sure. So I think from your conversation with Barbara last week, she talked a little bit about the school to prison pipeline that nationally, after those zero tolerance policies were implemented, it didn't take long for folks to realize that the harsh approach didn't work. It didn't improve school safety. It didn't improve behavior. Suspensions and expulsions went up instead of down. And it also had a serious impact, a disparate impact on students of color and students with disabilities. And it was amplified for students who sort of live at the intersection of those two identities. So the research showed that the impact of negative and exclusionary discipline was long lasting. You were more likely to be suspended again if you were suspended once. You were more likely to drop out of school. You reduced academic engagement. That's not a surprise. You're pushed out of school, so you feel pushed out of school. And then academic performance, right? You're missing more school, and you're disconnected. So what nationally, what schools are focusing on, and in Maryland, are two not mutually exclusive approaches. One is an evidence-based, multi-tiered behavioral framework. In Maryland and in many other states, the program or the approach is called PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Support. So it's really a structured approach of interventions that are for everyone and then more targeted as the behavior gets more serious. And it's the goal is to improve school climate and safety. The other approach is restorative practices or restorative approaches, and they aren't mutually exclusive at all. Many school systems, I would say Maryland also, after implementing PBIS, Positive Behavior Intervention Support,
Thank you.
took it to a certain level, and then are like, well, what else can we do? How can we continue the improvement? And that was a turn toward restorative practices. Then to schools to say, okay, we can do that too. It all kind of came together around 2014, 2015 as some different initiatives at the federal level started to happen, and some research started to emerge around restorative practices and how effective they were. So that's what we see broadly. There are also, schools are always implementing a variety of I would say smaller programs to address targeted needs like anti-bullying, social emotional learning, just different programs. But those two approaches are big and systemic within the either the school system. They're broadly supported, and there's a lot of sort of national attention to both of those approaches, and they're evidence-based, both of them.
Wonderful. And yeah, it's wonderful that schools take on approaches, right? If you're not from the education field, I think some people remember back to, you just go to the principal's office and that was kind of it. Then you have detention. When did that stop? When did these approaches, schools are taking them on? Is there any insight on it? Are those old approaches still happening in places?
I'm sure students are still being sent to the principal's office. I think one reason that we have data, right? We have data that's both being collected, and that's important to have schools and school systems collect data and then be able to analyze it in particular ways so you can target what you're doing. I'm going to guess, and I'm not an expert on that at all, but I'm going to guess that's relatively recent. And by recent, I mean the last couple decades, right? That we sort of collect data and look at it in a particular way.
Right.
And then there's, as I said, these are national approaches that get a lot of national support and research. So I think as the real impact of suspensions and expulsions just kind of exploded, and the understanding of what it meant, we also researched that, right? That what does it mean to be suspended in elementary school? What does that mean for middle school and then high school? And we could do those longitudinal looks at the impact, and it's just devastating. So I think it's all of that.
Right. And I think that alone is really interesting for people to understand and remember and to learn that the old way per se of whether it's discipline or we'll talk about mediation in a second is not actually always effective. When we think about it in someone's own home, when how you respond to a child, how do they learn from it? So I'm excited to hear. I know we're obviously a part of it with the foundation. It's incredible to see that we're taking a deep dive and look into how it can impact the future of children. You work in mediation. I think a lot of people hear that word and think kind of older people, right? Not older like a senior, but in the sense of it's such a big word, right? So can you tell us a little bit about mediation, what it is and how it fits with restorative approaches?
Sure. So Maryland's really a leader in promoting mediation for the resolution of conflict in all sorts of areas. So mediation is a conflict resolution process where a trained neutral will assist parties in conflict to reach an agreement that meets their needs as they describe it, as they identify it. A mediator doesn't take sides. They won't tell people what to do. They won't make decisions for people about what might resolve their conflict. And they might result in an agreement that's in writing that can be enforced, or it may just result in an understanding, or it may result in no agreement, right? People might choose not to come to an agreement. So you're probably familiar with mediation, and the people listening are probably familiar with mediation in a court context. And Maryland has mediation at every level of the court, from small claims to appeals. And so you might find mediation through that avenue. Family custody disputes are all mediated first before they enter the courtroom. Many commercial litigation or other litigation matters go to mediation. And we, through the mediation clinic at the law school, we provide mediation in the district court, which you mentioned in your nice introduction. So our students go, when we can go to court, in the before pandemic times, we go to court. And we offer mediation services for day of trial. And then we also take referrals and teach the students how to mediate those matters. So within restorative practices, mediation is one of the restorative approaches that's included in the statute defining what a restorative approach can be in the educational setting. So then there's a range of practices that are included. So for mediation in a school, what that might look like is, it first could be pure mediation. It might be students as young as 3rd or 4th grade who have been trained to be mediators to help fellow students resolve disputes. They might be referred, and then they come and they sit at the table and they're like, what's going on for you? What's going on for you? What was happening? What would it do to fix this? And then they might write up that agreement or just come to an agreement. So these, the language of mediation, the asking questions, we do this at all ages, right? It works everywhere.
Right.
It also might be mediation by an outside provider. So the clinic also works with a Baltimore City school and our students go to the school and help mediate conflicts among students or between students. But that's an outside, an outside neutral coming in to assist. So it can look at a few different ways. It may be within the school that also an adult in the building is acting as a mediator for students.
Wonderful. And what are some of the skills that the students will get to take away from that experience that we can see, that we're hoping to see later in their lives,
Sure, the
blossom?
students in the mediation.
Yeah.
So the first thing they see is modeling. They hear and see language of asking questions, of being allowed to speak, of being asked to listen to someone who doesn't agree with you. And then seeing how a conversation can happen where needs can be met, right? Where you can sit and talk and then come to an agreement. And it's not just children that need help with this sometimes, right? I think there's always a time in any of our lives where having a neutral party assist you in that conversation, identify maybe repeat what you just heard but weren't listening to because you're so mad, things like that. Those are all, it's a process that can help people resolve their own conflicts. And that's key, right? Is helping people learn how to speak about what's important to them, to know that they'll be listened to, and then to make their own decisions, to that self-determination, to make decisions about what will meet their needs and find a resolution.
It's so important I know when they're learning about, we're teaching them prevention through this program, but that there's so many layers to it that we recognize why you're using the restorative approaches and teaching this information to the students, and they're getting so many important skills out of it that will help them. Like you said, I think there's a lot of adults out there that could use, an understanding of mediation, like you said, the skills to understand communication, to be heard, to listen and work things out. So that's wonderful.
We tell children often, like, use your words, to resolve it. And that's true. We should want people to use their words, but then we have to give them the words. This is how you talk about what's happening to you. These is language around feelings. That's a part of a restorative practices. This is what you can say. This is how you apologize. These are sort of soft skills. This is how you sit and listen. This is how you do it and show that you're listening. And all of that is a part of a restorative approach.
I mean, you could just see so many scenes in the future, whether it's two college students, two, partners, people together where, it's talking about teen dating violence. If they really had this ability, what some experiences how they could be changed, right? I just think people, especially, in your home with your partner or something like that, how a conversation could really be uplifted and be positive, to have something come out of it from these skills.
Yeah, they're basic communication skills. It's not complicated, but that doesn't mean it's not hard
Right.
to, talk about things that are affecting you.
Yeah. So I love this approach. I'm wondering, we learned a little bit about, you mentioned zero tolerance, and when restorative approaches kind of really hit the schools, in a positive light after, the zero tolerance policy they learned wasn't the most effective. And then I know that Barbara Groeschel mentioned, after Columbine, they said we really need a better solution. I'm curious about like the roots of it a little bit, if you could talk about the other places that restorative approaches have been used so we can really understand the impact that it makes.
Sure. So restorative justice, and that's, first of all, the language. In some places, you might hear about these processes as restorative practices or restorative justice. We use the term restorative approaches. So we get that idea of it as a broad umbrella of approaches toward helping people repair harm and address harm. But many scholars say that the roots of it under the term restorative justice had its roots in some justice traditions of Indigenous people, particularly the Maori tribes in New Zealand. Restorative practices took root and in the schools and elsewhere in New Zealand and Australia. So it kind of came over to us from there in many ways. But there are others who would say that the concept of bringing together the people who have been affected by harm and have done the harm, bringing them together with elders or in a community circle to decide what should be done and how that harm can be repaired. You mentioned how it might be helpful in a family. Well, sometimes that's what you do at a dinner table or in a family, or and in many other cultures, we can see that, that it's coming together and sort of not meting out punishment just in sort of a transactional way, but in really trying to understand what the harm was and how that can be repaired. So the underlying philosophy, if you could call it a philosophy, but that justice approach is that we have an obligation to our community. And when we conduct harm or violate a principle of the community, that needs to be repaired. So we don't just owe an obligation to serve a punishment or something like that, or pay a ticket, but we have an obligation to repair the harm we've done by our action. And that's what it's about, is determining what that harm was and how it affected the community and the person who was harmed, and then what will it do to heal it for them, right? Well, how are we going to heal the community and that person? So it's very personal in that way and community based. So restorative justice as a criminal justice theory really emerged in the US in the 70s early on, and it was approached out of a sense of a rehabilitation theory toward addressing harm. And we saw early some adoption of what we would call restorative practices or restorative justice, particularly in the juvenile justice arena. So we accept and we understand, like, well, young people are different maybe than adults, and they're still learning, and we're comfortable with a rehabilitative approach there. And so some of the things that you might see from that are like, and the justice system uses these terms, like the victim offender dialogues, mediation. It might be conferencing, it might be restitution programs, it might be some circles. So you may hear the concept of restorative justice out of a criminal justice setting, in juvenile justice, and then in some other community areas. So that's very broad in our justice system. Most states have some sort of restorative justice element, or at least using that term for criminal ideas. So the theory was there sort of in another setting for a while. And then in the school setting, New Zealand is really, and Australia, they're credited with developing a restorative justice concept, those practices, and then applying them to schools. Wow. So the same theory, the idea that we owe an obligation to our community and that relationships matter and that healing comes from repairing that community, and then putting it in the school context. So from that perspective, the restorative practices, some schools saw what Australia was doing. They were writing about what they had seen. I would say the early 21st century, like 2000s, we were starting to see some literature about that. And then many schools started adopting it, I would say in pockets. And then when 2008, the American Psychological Association published a report on zero tolerance and the psychological impact of what these disciplinary measures that had emerged in the 90s in our country and the impact they were having. So I said before that, you know, it's their negative and long-lasting effects of those push out, those exclusionary discipline practices. So you saw two things happen. We saw the impact of zero tolerance at the same time that we were seeing some literature and some research on restorative approaches, right? That was having some positive effects. So by 2008, many states were already trying this on. San Francisco, Minnesota, Colorado, Texas, some schools in Maryland. By 2007, Baltimore had a few schools that were trying restorative practices. And conferencing had been in Baltimore even in the 90s, right? So it's the intersection, I think, of those two things, that what we were trying on wasn't working. And then in 2014, the administration sent a letter, what's called a Dear Colleague letter, sent a letter to every school superintendent, and it was jointly signed by the Secretary of Education and from the Department of Justice. So what that letter said was, look, zero tolerance is not working, and laid out some of the data and what we were seeing. And schools were like, well, what can we do? You know, what can we do? We can't do that. We agree. You know, what can we try? And within I think a footnote of the letter, I'm not sure, they said restorative practices appears to be a promising practice. So not saying that the evidence is all there, but saying that that's something that you might want to look to. And after that, many school systems really started looking at what it was, how they might use it, how they might put it into their school. And some individual teachers would try it, or school counselors would try it. And that's really how it evolved. And since 2014, we've just seen more data. And I'd also say the federal government put more money behind researching the impact of what it was. So we're also starting to see some nice evaluations and studies come out that are sort of that gold standard of what good research looks like. Because before that, it really had been hard to do that work, and based on anecdotes. And reasonably, people want to know if it works before I try.
That's a great timeline, and really understand why it's important, how it helps. And, you know, I think we know it's unique with the program that we're working on, that they're taking restorative practices and using it to prevent sexual assault. And I think you made it very clear how, you know, it's community based, and it creates an individual who you know, wants to see change in their community, but there's skills that come along with that. So, and starting early, kids are different than adults, right? But I do think that we can see how this could be very valuable for adults as well. You touched a little bit on the research that's coming out about the approach. And I know a lot of people are curious about the behaviors that come with it, you know, the experience. I know that Barbara Groeschel had mentioned a little bit, and I've heard myself, just about how, you know, maybe the children are the ones who decide what happens after an experience. So they sometimes even give themselves like a harsher, not punishment, but something that they have to do to kind of rectify what they've done. But I'm curious about the change that you were hoping to see in their attitudes and behaviors using this approach with our prevention.
Sure. Well, first, let me give some context to what restorative approaches are and how we see them in schools. So it's a range, or sometimes called a spectrum, of tools that when we talk about it, that's what most schools are doing, right? So at the sort of low end of intervention are all the things that schools would do to build relationships. And really that's the core of restorative approaches in schools. Is the rule of thumb that you might hear is that 80% of the work of restorative practices should be on creating connections and relationships. So it's using what we call affective language, language around emotions, like how did you feel when X happened? You know, how do you feel now when that happened to you? Learning to use language around emotion, demonstrating that for students, all the amazing things you do in a school to create school spirit, to create school connection, whether it's team building, whether it's adults knowing the names of students and calling them by name. It's from the moment you step on that campus, all of that work. And I really want to emphasize that, because when we study it, we look at outcomes, but really the bulk of work happens at a lot of different things that you can do to build relationships, because relationships create that social emotional capital. So and that's what you draw on when you have to respond to harm or to misbehavior. So you build that relationship. Outside of the restorative practices context, there's a lot of research that shows that an unrelated caring adult has an enormous impact on the success of a child and when they grow to be adult. So we start there. And then there are other tools. One of them that's most commonly implemented when a school adopts restorative practices are circles. So if you walked into a kindergarten, you would likely see kids sitting in circle if kids were in schools, right? You know, so we're used to that idea that coming together in circle and sitting and talking. It's where students who are young learn how to sit still, how to listen, how to speak when they are allowed to. And circles have a certain structure that students can readily adopt. And students love circles because, well, why do you think they love circles? Why do you think, Marissa?
Well, they get to be seen. No one's behind them or in front of them, depending on their comfort level physically. But then also, I know, I just being seen and having the chance to be heard, or to skip, but you're a part of something.
Right,
And
you're a part of something. Yeah. You're part of that community. Everyone's included, even if you don't speak, like you said. And I get to not just be seen, but I also can there's a place for me to speak, right? So I'm listened to, I have a voice, I get to make choices about how I participate or choose not to participate. And there's a structure that is ritual based. So, and it immediately creates that connection that you talked. Yeah, I'm a part of something. This is our circle. So that's why it's such a strong tool. Again, restorative practices didn't invent circles, but they bring them into it as a tool, and they're really useful. And we in our experience see them valuable from kindergarten through 12th grade, and there are many college campuses that are also adopting restorative practices, both for building relationships and then also to address harm. So those are the sort of proactive, preventive tools that are used, and circles can be used to teach. They can be used to do planning, to address problems, but so they're preventive. And then at the responsive end, there's a little bit more structure, and that's where you talk about impromptu conferencing, formal conferencing. Those might occur. Maybe someone is suspended for a serious issue, but then when they come back, how do we reintegrate them into the class? And so that might be a time that you have a conference with people who have been harmed or affected by what happened, whatever that may be. So that's how we see it. But that foundation is on relationships and relationship building. And then the conferencing has specific language, right? Specific questions that we call restorative questions, right? What happened? What was happening to you at the time? What were you thinking? Who was effective? How much? What do you need to do to fix this, to repair the harm? To the person who was harmed, you'd say, what do you need? What's been hard for you? And there you can see that it's a very individual conversation, where people get to say what was hard for them, and maybe an apology is what they need, or maybe they don't need anything more. They just need to have been able to tell their story and how it impacted them. Or maybe they really need something that might not be in a discipline code, right? You know, that when we make a response to behavior just sort of a transactional list of punishments that apply to this, that we miss out on really repairing something that was very individual.
That's an incredible picture that you painted, I think, for people to see how the change can happen from an experience. And I know that, developing of a voice, right, of those children, and that it is trauma informed. It's thoughtful about both parties and more involved, right? It's not just the 2 or 3 individuals, but other people in the setting, possibly community members, depending on the situation. And there's so much beauty in the opportunity to talk about these things. We work with the middle school students to see, maybe before the behaviors, reach the higher violence that we've seen in to be able to have this happen, to experiences that happen earlier.
Mhm.
So that's,
Yeah, one thing we've heard anecdotally in schools that principals tell us that the children come to them and say, we need a circle. We need to sit down. I want to sit down with them because of what happened and talk about it. So they recognize it as a tool which is helping them to have a conversation. So that's really exciting when students understand something as something they own, but also something that they can make decisions about.
that's incredible. And I'm curious also about a little bit, I know I think it helps reduce PTSD in some ways, right? So a child that maybe if an experience was handled one way, but in using this method, there's some positive pieces that they're not fearful in the future because it was handled within this process to help them feel better. I know that's more of a responsive than the preventative that we were talking about before. Is there anything you can speak to on that, how they, the child that maybe the action happened to isn't as fearful in the future because it was mediated in a way that they feel strongly about or feel positive about?
Yeah, I wouldn't say the research is there yet on that, but that really might be true. There is research that shows that zero tolerance policies have a negative impact on the schools, on the students who aren't misbehaving, right? Seeing that disruptive atmosphere and the sort of constancy of people being pulled out and that discomfort of those very negative actions, that has a impact on the students who are following the rules, right? That in a negative impact. So we do know that. I think that the research on restorative practices is really at its early level, in the sense that we haven't been able to dig deeper on some of those long-term impacts on the rest of the community. But across the board, the research shows that suspensions and expulsions go down, and in many cases they go down dramatically, right? When a school adopts sort of that whole school approach. That teachers report greater job satisfaction. Teachers report that they see less disruptive behavior, and that student behavior improves, and there's a greater connection to in school climate, right? So I think school climate, and then studying that, I think that speaks to how the broader school community might feel as a disruption is addressed in a different way, maybe. So there's a lot more we can learn. There's a lot of hope around restorative practices to address that racial disparity in discipline that we see. The evidence there is in some ways promising, in some ways mixed. We have to really see that discipline it does improve, but does that gap close? Some schools have seen it close, some have not. We don't know why. We have to see. There's a lot of research to be done on those other impacts, like on academics. Some schools see academic performance improve. In many studies, that's not what they're looking at, so we don't know whether it has an impact. And then just that whole issue of how we measure school climate and improvement, lots more to study there. So we're at an interesting stage because it's we have so much hope around what it might promise, but we also don't want to be disappointed. We want, when we're not studying it, we're not sure. And that's the other piece too, is how do we study implementation, right? How do we know what a school is doing? Or have they, after training and implementation, are they implementing well? Are they implementing it with fidelity? That's the next stage of research also. And it's early days there too.
Yeah, I know that we're excited that that's in the plan, right? The train the trainer model and what that looks like. And I know right now we're in the schools. I'm not physically right now, but we've gotten to do that, and we're excited about once we can get back into the schools and the research that comes along with it to see those outcomes and look at them, to really be at the forefront of this. It's incredible. We talked a little bit about what in the month of teen dating violence prevention and awareness. We talked about the skills that kids do learn, and we talked about what that might look like at someone's home. But I'm just curious from your perspective, so you have children that had this, experience to learn about, with restorative practices and the sexual assault prevention that we do. What is the hope of the future that, an experience that they might go through and those skills that they'll be able to use in their life that otherwise they might not have had if they didn't have this, these kind of lessons or this program, so to speak?
Yeah, so the first hope through the Aaron's Talk curriculum is that delivering that information, right? That we're using circles. The students receive the curriculum it's circle based. So we're hoping first that they get that they take in that information, that sort of as a pedagogical tool, it works, right? To convey what we want them to know about sexual assault prevention and some of those guidelines. And then we're going to measure, afterward, immediately and then later, how much is retained. So that's the first thing, is just that information. We want them to know that. And then we want to measure attitude change, so some of what's talked about are attitudes around stereotypes around girls and boys and what they should be like. So has that attitude shifted toward, attitudes around sexual assault or around sexual behavior? Has there been a shift? So we're going to look at that. And then we want to measure, is there that increased school connectedness, that because they had this experience of receiving this curriculum, did it impact how they feel about school? One of the great things about circles with sort of sensitive information, if you will, like these are hard things and really hard things for adolescents to talk about, right? So, is this an effective way to give students voice and be respectful to them about their honesty and respecting what they're sharing, and then sort of shift some of those attitudes that are negative about that. So that's the hope, and then long term, like you, Marissa, hopefully giving students language and opening their eyes around the practices or attitudes around sexual behavior or femininity or masculinity that maybe make some shifts there. Wouldn't that be great if it could be broadly implemented, and then that became a more common language, a more common approach to feeling that you can speak up and identify boundaries for yourself, and that you'll have allies around you and your friends, and to protect you and support you in that. And someone who felt independent enough to say, well, I'm not so sure about that. I don't agree with what you're saying there. All of those are enormous skills, and that's our hope for the future. But the first thing we want to make sure is that they got the information right around sexting and healthy boundaries and relationships and attitudes.
Yes, the long-term effect of it is quite remarkable, because as we speak to more people that are adults well on into their life, they're like, wow, I wish I had learned that, whether, and it's something as simple as, like you said, boundaries. I had spoken to someone who she had said, I was never told that I could tell somebody, like, please, please give me some space, or I don't like that, or don't touch me, or, don't touch my mobility device. So I think, there's a lot of simplicity, like you said. It's complex in its, delivery and all the steps we have to take to do the research. But this information is so, it's like at the core of who we are as people. And so you can really see how it'll make a great impact. And that's what we're working to do. It's a long-term investment for sure. And we're excited to be a part of it.
Yeah, it's exciting work. It is. Yeah.
I see that. I want to pause real quick. Does anybody have any questions? I have a couple more questions, but I just did want to throw it out there. You can use the chat if you wanted, and we'll pay attention to it. You can chat to Stacy and I directly. But I'll keep going. Just wanted to put that out there. Thank you everybody for joining. I'm curious about what you're hearing from schools that stop them from taking on, a program like this. I know that we help with the delivery, and we have the law students and the social work students that get to go into the schools and make it, quote unquote, as easy as we can for the school staff. But I'm curious of your perspective, what are some of those roadblocks that we might face?
Right. That's the wonderful thing about this curriculum and this program, is that it does meet a need, a curriculum need of the schools. And so in that way, it's very appealing. When we talk about restorative practices generally in schools, what sort of inhibits administrations or teachers from sort of really embracing it and creating that buy-in, that's what we hear over and over and over, the buy-in piece. I think there's a few reasons around that. For a school, schools are encouraged to take that whole school approach to restorative practices. The one of the schools that the Aaron Talk curriculum is in right now has years of experience with restorative practices. The students are comfortable and used to sitting in circle. The teachers are used to that as a model, and that the administration is deeply supportive of restorative approaches as a culture for their school. So going into an environment like that is ideal, right? There's no groundwork, that the foundation is there to bring in this curriculum. For schools that are just turning to restorative approaches, there's first a cost, like a monetary cost to becoming a restorative school, right? We want people to know all this information, and we want to train them. So there's a cost to training, there's a cost in money and a cost in time. There's really professional development time for teachers is precious, right? So there's that sort of tension. And it's not a one and done training, right? You really want everyone to be trained, and there's lots of turnover. So you want to keep up with the training. You want your staff to have the same language, to have the same experience. And so you have to stay on it and keep your attention on it, I guess. And then teachers also say, where's my time? Right? Sounds like this takes time. Where do I add time? Right? So
adding something else.
Yeah, and so it feels like another thing being asked of them, and we try and bring in data that shows that, well, you're spending a lot of time dealing with disruption. What would it be like to get back that time, right? So really trying to make that argument seem
Mm.
that you're really going to save time if the whole culture can change within the school. But time is real, and so that's another reason that administrative leadership support is absolutely essential for implementing something like restorative approaches. The leadership has to uh, accommodate the schedule, make sure there's space in it. Similarly, with a curriculum like this, got to make sure there's a place for it, that there's a time for it. And I mean place as in literally space for the students to sit in the circle. Space is a premium. So navigating some of that is something that you have to do in every school. And also educators, and this may happen with this curriculum, we don't know yet, but educators want to know something works, right? So it's like, okay, I don't want this to be the program of the year that I'm being asked to do. They want to make sure that it's going to be sustainable, that it's going to be sustained. And I think the Maryland State Department of Education is showing that they're committed to restorative approaches. And I think that'll help with the curriculum being brought into schools, that it'll sort of dovetail right in with that. That's the hope. So the exciting part right now for this work, and hopefully post-pandemic we can get back into the schools, is that we're gonna be studying it, right? Where it is going to be studied. Is that information conveyed? Do students retain it? Did it have an impact on suspensions, referrals, things like that? Did it improve school climate? And being able to bring forward that kind of data will be it's so exciting. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. You touched on this a little bit. I know you guys do so much. How is this different, right, than things that you've done before? I know we're kind of the marriage between sexual assault prevention and restorative practices, but if there's a little touch on that from you, I'm curious.
Well, I think that is really unique. That is what sets it apart from the other work we've done, but also sets it apart nationally. Like, this is the first program doing something like this at the school level, at the middle school level. So that's why it's so exciting and really truly groundbreaking. And then has that potential, right, to really be able to be broadly implemented or distributed. And then it's exciting to see just sort of that tipping point, hopefully, in the state, in an approach to restorative approaches, that it is now being really asked of all school districts. One of the things that our center is doing in a restorative collaborative that we have now with the state is a landscape. Maybe Barbara mentioned this, but we're asking and drawing information from all school districts to say, what are you doing on restorative practice? What's actually happening now on the ground? And that's a huge value to know, both identifying where people are maybe more along the road to full implementation, where there are gaps. Maybe there are unique things that some schools are doing really well that other school systems can hear about and share. So those things are just really exciting. Mm-hmm.
So yeah, thank you so much. I mean, this was a really incredible dive on, how it's implemented, where it came from, the practice, and the change that it really makes, the long term, we're hoping to see change in the children, and then blending that with prevention for sexual assault, and how kids can learn early, and have all those behaviors and attitudes that will make them, hopefully, individuals that, have healthy relationships, that value community, to prevent this harm from happening in the future. Is there anything you want to add to that before we close?
No, you said it well. You said it well.
Thank you. But we're so thankful for, all the individuals that help make this happen, right, Stacy? Like, the research, like you said, is so incredible. And this is an exciting time, and it's long term till we can make this change. And it takes quite the investment.
as you know.
Yes,
Yeah.
yeah, but we're excited about it. I mean, we couldn't do it without the community, and we're just really thankful for that. And we're, I think in a previous discussion I had, it's all about scaling, and that's an exciting conversation to be having about how we get this to more students, more schools, statewide, national, and take it from there. And it's very exciting that it's here in Baltimore starting. It's something that we can really be proud of together, for sure.
Yeah, it is exciting. And Baltimore has been a leader with a lot of different organizations pushing restorative practices. So we really are in the right geographical location to try out this curriculum and test it. And so it's all exciting.
Wonderful. Well, thank you, everybody. I hope you have a great day. There'll be more webinars posted. Join us again next week. We're very excited about this, all of the webinars we had this month around teen dating, violence, and prevention. So thank you so much. Have a great day.
Thanks for your work.
Of course. Thank you. Bye, Stacy.
Bye.